All right, you guys, you can see Matt is
Good
here
morning.
on the screen. Matt, how are you?
I'm really good. Thanks, Damon. How are you?
I'm fantastic.
What? It's not like I've never said that before, is it?
Yeah. You just have the best tone when you say it. It's always like, "Are you joking?" Or, but
No.
cool.
No, I'm really good. The sun's out. I'm on a Twitch stream with you. It's all good.
Amazing. You got a record out as well. Let's not forget.
That is also very exciting.
That is also true. Okay, so Matt's the OG inspiration for modular cases. Let's start. Okay, so hopefully you saw there, OMLab in the chat. Matt is just saying big ups on the amazing release.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
We had a lot of love. I don't know if you saw the earlier parts of the stream, but a lot of love for the new record. Why don't we just jump right in on the record? I was going to jump in on modular cases, but I guess we should actually talk about the record.
Let's talk about the record, because if we start on modular synths, we'll get to like 11 o'clock and we won't have talked about anything.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So Matt, I know that you've got your cover is a picture of a body of water with a semi-submerged stone. I understand that's nearby.
That is true, yeah.
And your bio, your press release about the record, I think, is one of the most in-depth considerations of your feelings I've ever seen committed to print.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just really struggled to do anything last year that felt in any way meaningful, because there still is so much craziness, and particularly back in like March, April, May, there's just this overwhelming feeling of doom where it just felt like anything I might want to contribute to the world was a complete waste of time. And I sort of really struggled with the idea of just doing anything that wasn't pointless. And so the whole idea of I guess like the concept behind the record and the artwork and stuff was just this idea that within all that, I need to find some sort of internal space that I'm comfortable with, where I'm not just totally overwhelmed with the state of the world. And I know I think previously when I've worked on projects, it becomes a bit more kind of throwaway in a way. It's, I'm working on this and I'm doing this and this is going to be about this. And in a sense, it doesn't really matter, because you're just sort of making something. And then because of all the craziness last year, it just felt like it needed a bit more like thought put to it than that for me. And so, I'm super lucky that me and my family live kind of pretty much in the middle of nowhere. So we're still able, even with all the lockdown and stuff, we're still able to get outside and go on walks. And so this feeling of like being near the ocean and being outside and having a sense that actually like the world is still here, was really important to me. And so that's basically where the record came from.
So was it a way to like create a space for yourself, and like did the making the record itself become almost like your form of meditation, or your form of just like living in a reality that you wanted to live in, as opposed to the reality
kind of
out there?
Both. I mean, I think when I start on a record project, I'm always trying to create some kind of sound world that creates a feeling in somebody that's listening to it, and obviously like you can't be totally in control of how people, obviously can't be in control of how people respond to stuff that you make, but I felt it was important on this one to make something that gave people some kind of like meditative comfort sort of state, which really is just more like the antithesis of the project that I put out before, which was kind of, literally about the end of the world. And it you listen to it and it's kind of stressful, mm-hmm. And that was intentional. And I kind of gravitate to music like that. But it just felt ridiculous to put out a record that was stressful in 2020, so yeah, it was a bit of both, really. It was a process for me of just trying to really hone in on like sonically how you respond to sounds and textures that make you feel one way rather than another way, and then hopefully when people listen to that, they get a sense of that kind of quasi-meditative state.
And were you just mentioned actually being very deliberate about the project, and you've done, this is what, your 7th album now, Matt, or 8th, or
it's kind of like, in my mind it's the 8th record that I've done of like my own music. It's the 4th one that has actually had like an official release.
Okay, cool. I'm curious, did that always been the case that like before you go into making a record, you're like, this is the vibe and this is what it's about? Or is this something that's developed more recently where you're like, I want to make a body of work that has a theme?
You know what, it usually happens about halfway through. So I reckon it takes me about 12 months to put a record together. 12 to 18 months. And so probably the first half of that period, I'm literally just messing around with ideas and jamming and recording these really long jam sessions of me on synths and just literally messing about. But because our life is our life, and so even when you're just messing about, there's something in that you're going to do that is a reflection of what your life is like at that time. Through that process, I find that I kind of hone it down. I'm like, oh, well, I'm tending to do things that are a bit like that. And so what does that mean? And how can you like hone in on that and make it more about that? So I've never yet started literally started from scratch going, oh, this is going to be about this. But it usually becomes apparent pretty quick over a period of time where I'm making a record that, oh, this is what this is going to end up being like and being about. And I'd love to make that. I'd love to get to that point sooner, because I feel like all the time before that, you're just kind of flailing about aimlessly. And then as soon as you've got a concept, in a sense, it becomes way easier, because then all of these little micro decisions that you're making about, I don't know, what's that bass sound like, or how do I EQ that? It's like, well, does it feel like that? Or does it not feel like that? And if it feels like that, then you're in the right direction. If it doesn't, then you're not, and you do something else. So I feel like I tend to have all these sort of visual pictures in my mind, and if I've got a visual sort of concept of what a track is about or what an album's about, I can just kind of visualize that picture, and then everything goes like 20 times faster, because suddenly all these little micro choices are kind of made for you, and you end up not procrastinating about, like, delay effects and all this kind of stuff, because it's just like, oh, well, is it that? No, okay, well, it's, you move on. So yeah, I'd like it to be that conceptual phase happens sooner than it does, but yeah, it just seems to kind of morph gradually into that.
Well, it's interesting that you're still talking about like hitting a clear point where you understand what it is. There's like that old kind of quote, it's something like, the map making itself brings forth the features of the terrain. And then do you find that there's like a real like clear aha moment, or is it a little bit more gradual? And then when you kind of realize what it is, do you sit down and write a manifesto, or do you have a process of really like defining what that picture is?
For the stuff that I've done so far, it's always been pretty quick. Like the tipping point from having no concept to having a reasonably formed concept, for me, seems to be pretty quick. I just wish it would happen sooner. But you go through this period of just basically messing about, and then for me it's usually a combination of like a couple of books that I've read, or some ideas that people are talking about, or in this case just the idea of being able to get out for a walk and how massively important that is, where we're at the moment. And then it's like, oh, that's what this is. And then I don't tend to write down a manifesto, but I think about it a lot. I spend a lot of time, usually when I can't sleep, just like processing the ideas in my head and coming up with pictures, really, like some kind of picture storyboard in my mind of what this thing is. And
are we talking
I
do you literally see images in your mind? Or is it kind of more of like a multi-sensory feeling, quasi-emotional?
No,
space?
it's quite imagery based, actually. Like I remember, and actually, the record that I put out before this one was very much kind of influenced by extinction and the way that species go extinct all the time, and the fact that, you know, not so long ago people didn't really understand that there was even a concept of extinction. And I had all these pictures of basically like this sort of dystopian landscape that were really well formed in my mind, but, you know, and that never outside of my mind. And then it's that kind of weird thing where you're mixing a track and you're sort of placing all your instruments within that landscape and seeing if they make sense or not. And so with this one, it was like the same idea, but the completely opposite concept, where like that the photograph that's on the cover was taken by a really good friend of mine who lives quite near me, and I was talking to him about artwork, and he showed me a bunch of photographs that he'd taken, and this particular one I was kind of like, that's like surprisingly close to this sort of sonic landscape picture that I've got in my mind. So that's the artwork. Thank you very much. Brilliant. And yeah, so I think they're usually pretty well formed images. And I find it really useful. I don't remember where I read this now, but I was reading some article about it might have been a Nigel Godrich interview, I can't remember, but he was talking about when he's mixing a band and he's basically like imagining all these little miniature figures sitting on the meter bridge of the console, and you're kind of like, oh yeah, that's where the guitar is. And so it, you know, in a sort of simplistic sense, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to pan that over here and pan that over here, but you also get this like sense of, it helps you paint that like three-dimensional space, you know. And so particularly on that track Kalimba, in my mind I kind of imagine that as this like that bass line thing is kind of like this old dude with like a sort of homemade string bass thing. Do you know, like the one string bass thing?
Yeah.
And he's sort of sitting on the beach and just doing this sort of meditative thing. And
yeah.
And it's trying to, you know, trying to place all those sounds in that landscape in a way that kind of hopefully makes sense.
Amazing. And Matt, I think this is fascinating. I never knew that about you. Can I just tell everyone in the chat, like Matt and I first met when we were both children, basically. I think we met when we were 20 or something like that. And I've been saying this a lot in the build up to our conversation, but like, the thing I love about you most, well, one of the many things I love about you most, but it's like you're like the endless onion. It's almost like every time I get to talk to you, I find out more things about you. So that's really interesting, Matt. But what really struck me with that is it's almost like you're able to give yourself like a brief. And for everyone who's like wondering how can Matt like just crank out tracks like this so quickly and so beautifully, I think, can we talk a little bit about, you know, your day job, or one of your many day jobs, and the fact that you have spent a huge amount of time doing music for picture, music for media, so you really understand, like, does this fit the brief for this project? And you must have like that instinct, whether you've consciously acknowledged it or not, must be very strong in you.
I think I have totally consciously acknowledged it. And in a sense, I wish I'd acknowledged it more consciously a long time ago. Because I fought against this idea for such a long time that I guess like this utopic idea of the freedom to create anything, which is a beautiful idea. But for me, unless I've got some pretty strong boundaries in place, I literally just won't finish anything ever. And so when I started, I guess like probably my first sort of proper job in the music industry was writing music for TV commercials, and I did a lot of them, which isn't to say that I actually got a lot of them, because the first rule of TV commercials is that you have to like pitch on about between 50 and 100 to get one, so you're constantly churning out a lot of material really quickly. And I guess through that process I'd find myself going, yeah, but this I know this guitar part really wants to go like this, and it just musically that makes sense, and that like that term in my head, musically that makes sense. And I find myself very seldom now going musically that makes sense, because musically seems to be one of the sort of less important parts of it, which sounds like a ludicrous thing to say, but it's like there's all I guess I should caveat that by saying that I think I've been trying to break out of my reasonably formal music education since I stopped being in formal music education. And so I guess like throughout my teenage years, and I went to university and studied music, there was a lot of this kind of stuff where it's like, this is how this system works, and if you're writing music like this, it has to go like this, and these are the rules, and blah 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 blah. And it took, I mean, yeah, and I'm still kind of breaking out of that, but particularly when you try and enforce those like music rules in the wider field of, you know, creating output for things like TV and particularly film, where like the music is definitely not the most important thing. Like, it's a service industry, right? You're making music to make the whole concept of the project bigger and better than it is. And so you've got to serve that like bigger medium. And it used to really irk me, and I'd be really frustrated because I'm like, well, this isn't writing music. This is just like making a thing for this thing. But they're all the same thing. And so like within my own projects, I've like totally sort of paradoxically, I'm now like, oh, what I need is a brief, and I need some, you know, boundaries to set myself. And then suddenly you find yourself like outputting a ton of material. Well, not a ton, but you know.
Well, it's just what you were saying about like the decision then becomes easy.
Yeah,
right.
Totally.
And I think like it's such a challenge sometimes when you don't have those boundaries or understand what you're making, because you have an infinity of possibilities in all directions. And then personally, I just tend to pivot 360 degrees looking around and not moving in any direction.
Totally.
So
totally.
I just think this is such an interesting point, Matt, because it's like you're saying, you're kind of making a bit of a joke that creativity should be free, but in many ways it feels like the creative aspect that you've really unlocked is like it's on a higher dimension now, ultimately. Like, but seriously, it's like you're making music, you're exploring, and then you uncover like a larger truth to communicate, or a larger concept to communicate, or a larger feeling to communicate, or you understand what that body of work is meant to be about, and that then informs what the music is supposed to be.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully.
Well, it seems to be working.
I don't know. I mean, it's like it's the whole thing is a massive learning curve, obviously. Yeah, I find the process really fascinating. I find, you know, I'm always inspired when, through doing quite a bit of work in TV and film and various album projects, I work with a whole bunch of people who are like infinitely more accomplished than I am in so many like levels of the game. And it's always like usually if I work on a project with somebody else that I admire and that I feel is like more successful than me, whatever that means, usually the things that I take away from it and not, oh, isn't it great how they got that sound, or that bit of music that they wrote there is great. It's totally just a attitude thing of how their creative process works. And I'm always like blown away with certain people by, I guess I think the main thing, which is like my you know, I guess like one of the main things that I try and work on for myself is like not comparing yourself to other people and what they're doing, and in a sense just caring less about other people's opinions, which isn't to say that you shouldn't care, and it's not like, oh, don't care, but it's like that ability to not take on other people's stuff and have this focused idea of your own stuff is, for me, what seems to separate people that I look at and are kind of like, yeah, I want to be where they are in 20 years time. Those are the people that seem to have this really defined idea of what their project is about and what their creative process is about. So in a sense, it's kind of like if I come up with a brief of what my album is about, in a way, that's me also kind of saying, well, I've defined this as this thing, which means it's not any of those things, which means I can't even now compare it to any of those things because those things aren't about this thing.
Say that all again. So that's a brilliant hack. I just want to, I want to all caps you. Can you just... So...
But it's like it's almost like a self-protection mechanism in a way, you know, because it's like, you know, I'll listen to, you know, hundreds of records that I listen to frequently that still like blow my mind, and the sort of the you know, bad record producer on this shoulder is kind of like, yeah, but your drums don't sound as good as blah blah blah, and then good record producer is like, yeah, but that record's not about what your record is about, so you can't even, it's not even a reasonable or sensible comparison. And then suddenly your drums, because they're about this thing, are amazing because they're about this thing.
I love it. Could you,
a total self-fulfilling prophecy.
Could you share with us, like, you know, maybe a few examples of when you saw that in action with someone you're working with? If you don't mind naming names, that would be killer. But just because it's such an important realization. But
so the last, well, I basically didn't really do anything last year because it was crazy. But the year before, I guess it was end of 2019, Arca asked me to set up a show for her in New York. And I met Arca through some work that I was doing with Björk, because Arca was playing with Björk for one of the tours that I was working on. And Arca had been asked to do these 3 shows at the Shed in New York, which is this sort of newish custom built arts venue. And she calls me up and she's like, so Matt, I've got this project and I'd really love it if you could basically build me a stage where I can just go and play music. And I was like, okay. Have you got any more information than that?
That's a very broad brief.
and she's like, well, you know, I mean, you know, the kind of stuff that I do, just, you know, I just want a playground. And I was like, oh, okay, an electronic music playground. And yeah, you know, we talked about finessing that idea a bit more, but fundamentally that was the brief. It was like, I want to be able to walk on stage and have an electronic music playground where I can make amazing stuff happen. Go do it. and it was amazing because in a sense that in a way it's kind of like that's exactly what I would want to do for a live show, but you always have these restrictions of like, well, who's going to set that up and how am I going to get all this gear from there to there and how's that going to sync up with that and how are they and so in my mind I'm like, well, that's never going to happen, I'm never going to do that. But because it's an Arca show and she's basically saying, well, can you just go and make this happen? I'm like, yeah, okay, I can make that happen. So the thing that was amazing about that for me was that basically it was this amazing opportunity for me to kind of improvise, really. So the very sort of short version of the story is that she had a stage set up that had like an acoustic piano with some looper pedals on it, an Ableton setup, this incredible like pole dancing pole that somebody had made for her that had like electronic what am I trying to say, like closeness proximity sensors to it.
Yeah.
So as she like went around this pole, it kind of created stuff.
Amazing.
Plugged into a Prophet 6.
Yeah.
Created all this stuff. So all these different electronic stages. Anyway, I'm getting the point of all this is the thing that actually blew my mind about that, more than the fact that she'd asked me to just make all this stuff, was the fact that she was just going to walk on stage and make up a show based on this electronic music playground, right? So there wasn't a set list. The Ableton computers had like some stems of some of her tracks, which I think maybe she used like once.
Yeah.
And she basically like improvised a really, you know, high level show, which was, I don't know, maybe 2 hours long. And it was just incredible. And the ability, like the confidence to do that, I find amazing. The ability to like define that show and say, okay, this is what this is. So I'm not going to compare it to this. Yeah, there's going to be bits where no sound comes out. Yeah, there's going to be bits where I need to figure this out. There's going to be all this stuff that in the wider context of putting a show together, a lot of people would kind of go, oh, well, we can't possibly do that because, you know, there's going to be like 30 seconds of silence there where somebody literally like unplugs this and plugs it into there, you know? But like that just sort of blew my mind, because like the confidence in yourself to not only just say, yeah, I'm just going to go and do this and basically make the whole thing up, but also the sort of confidence to know that is those are your boundaries. This is the definition of your show, or this is the concept for your album, or whatever, however you choose to package that up. In a sense, like it can't possibly fail, because you've been so confident about defining what it is that who's going to tell you that it was bad or wrong or whatever, all people could do is kind of go, yeah, that was awesome. And yeah, so that kind of blew my mind.
That's amazing. I love it. And could you think of like a really early version of like seeing that with someone like coming out, especially like, I think I'm interested in what you're saying, like coming out of university where it's like, these are the rules. Were you ever around someone in like a kind of artistic sense who was just like living by a different set of rules?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the first Björk show that I was involved in was probably very much like that, which you'll probably remember very well. So for anyone that doesn't know, Damien introduced me to Björk many years ago, and that started quite a long working relationship for which I'm eternally grateful. And on one of the projects that I was working with Damien, with Björk, on the start of the Volta tour, which must have been, what, I don't know, what, 12,
don't
13,
count the years. Don't count the years.
Long time ago. And so Damien was MDing the show and was on stage doing all the electronics, and there was a 10-piece brass section that was playing all the shows, and so my job in that setup was to do the brass arrangements, but also to do do a bunch of rehearsals with the brass players before we went out on tour. And there was the way Björk seems to work is that she'll have like 80 songs on the set list, because she's going to tour for 2-3 years and she wants to mix it up. So throughout the pre-production process, we were just doing like this vast number of songs, and we got to about 3 days before the opening show, and I just had this kind of crisis talk in my mind, this sort of crisis talk with Björk, where I was like, you know what, this isn't going to be ready. And yeah, I was 15 years younger than I am now, and I was like, I was trying to sort of put my foot down, and I was like, this isn't going to be ready. Like, this is what we need to do. We need to have a set list for the first week of shows, and we need to get that set right. And I was like, and in my mind, I was like, yeah, she's just gonna say, oh yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, let's do that. Let's make it happen. And she sort of gave me this quizzical look, and she was just like, Matt, how long have you been doing this for? And I was like, I 4 or 5 years. She was like, Matt, I did my first show when I was 9 years old. And I was just like, oh, this sort of crushing reality of the voice of experience, And I was just like, oh, okay. And so it ended up being how it was. And the how it panned out is that over the course of the beginning of the tour, everything like settled into place. And so you ended up in this situation where you had this like huge set list to choose from. And like a decade after that, I'm still kind of seeing the genius in that approach, because like you're on the road for 2 years doing a show every other night, and once you've done that for only probably 3 or 4 weeks, everyone on stage is starting to get a bit like, well, yeah, we can do this. We've got this dialed, and that's when things start getting like, that's when things go pear-shaped. And so she'll 20 minutes before you go on, she'll be like, oh, you know what, tonight we're going to do these 2 songs in the middle that no one's played for like 6 months.
No one's played for 6 months or a year.
Like, what? And then everyone's immediately really on their toes.
Yeah. Oh my god. And it's the one with the 15 million time signature changes, and yeah. Oh my god.
Totally. And so all the times that I've been fortunate enough to work on live shows with her, I always come away from it just being like astonished at the like resolute self-confidence and conviction in your own creative direction.
Has she ever told you that thing? I remember she just told me once we were sitting around and chatting, she was like, basically anything can be happening, but as soon as I set my course, like I can sing the song. And there's, Mark Bell had told me about an example when they were doing a warm-up show for Homogenic, and all the beats were running off Akai samplers, and a pitch bend message got sent to the whole bank of samplers. So all the samples were like pitched up 7 semitones, and like all the beats were, but she just goes like, here we go. And yeah. And I mean, totally. You played live with her in Biophilia so many times as well, which has like arrangements that are, I don't even know if there's a word in the language for it. But I had just had this experience. I'm just curious what your experience is of just like, she is like driving that ship no matter what. And even if you've got like a rack of equipment and 15 people on stage, she'll like just drag you through whatever hell and high water happens.
Totally. And it's totally astonishing. And this is kind of what I was saying earlier. I think, I'm with Björk in particular, but like, and with Arca, but with, all the people that I've had the good fortune to work with, who in my opinion are like doing incredible stuff. They've all got this like same thing where once they start on an idea, and whether that's like, that could be the concept for finishing a record, or it could be just getting through this song on this particular gig. It's like they're this massive like freighter ship that once it's going like that, it takes you've got to wait for a week before you can actually turn it over. Which is an amazing skill to have. And yeah, I mean, there were definitely cases with Björk where a song would start and some technical thing would happen where you just knew at the beginning that by the time you got to the middle 8, there was going to be this like huge car crash of some sort, and there was nothing you could do to stop it.
Yeah.
And she knew it as well.
Yeah.
But she just like goes straight through it. And there were some incredible situations where things that I really thought could have been utterly disastrous turned out to be the things where in like the press reviews the next day it was like, oh, and that version of XXX whatever song she did was like the most incredible rendition ever. And you're like, whoa, I mean that yeah, it's amazing.
Actually, when our second show, which was headlining Coachella, this is a tour that Matt set up, everyone, her song Hyper Ballad is always at like quite a peak point in the set. And I feel wrong saying this, but it was like she came in early, like kind of one chord progression early. So it's just so funny what you're saying there about like, there's going to be this thing that happens. And I just wound up like just turning down the volume on the bass at the right point, and she went for the go through, and then like Mark Bell's beats normally kick in, and they just totally didn't. But she like kept going, and then it was when it all just goes the blow up. But Matt, I wanted to kind of, there's a parallel thing here, which Björk is a phenomenal example of. I love what your example with Arca, but I think maybe in a way, having now listened through to your stems and really thinking a lot more about like the way that you're making music. There's kind of, I think, this idea of being like open to chaos, basically, like you're not in control of everything. And I don't know if you saw this, I was mentioning before you came on that your stems were some of the most interesting I've seen, because I was like, oh, this track is like really big and beautiful and huge, and I was expecting like like a big thing of stems, and it was like there's like 5 tracks or something like that, but it's like, oh wow, like just what you're doing on like you're able to take one idea and really like let it go somewhere. So we've had some amazing questions in the chat actually, which we'll come back to, everyone, but we're kind of gonna just start to lean over and touch on some technology a little bit more. So you're obviously like very deliberate about your choices in the studio, Matt, and I'm just wondering how you kind of keep that chaotic or unpredictable or almost like collaborative with your equipment element active when you're working.
Yeah, it's a good question. You know what, I feel like it's sort of 50% all the things we were just talking about, and 50% becoming a dad 5 years ago. And Sia, who's my daughter, when she was well, basically as soon as she could walk, she'd come into the studio and press everything. and all, like all the really interesting stuff that you really don't want to mess with too much. Like, I mean, I've got this this is her favorite thing to mess with, which is the circle on sequencer down here, which, like, once you've got it dialed and all the CVs tuned in and it all working, it's a beautiful thing. But it's like just the nature of analog gear, it's pretty easy to screw it up. So Sia would come in and she's like, oh, look at all these buttons, look at all this. And it just became apparent super quick that there was just no point in fighting that. And so I just totally embraced it. And and you'd switch it, you'd press go the next day, and this bizarre thing would come out of it, and you're like, oh, it's kind of neat, I'll do something with that. That's kind of a trite example, but I do really think that has had quite a big impact on stuff that I do, because before I had kids, it was very easy to carve out like a 6-hour chunk in the studio where you're like, I'm gonna really dial in on this, I'm gonna do this, and like now that's just like a total impossible dream. But like we were saying with the thing of saying, I don't want to work within a restricted brief, and then finding out that actually working within a restricted brief is really positive for me anyway. I'm now finding that I do love to be able to carve out a chunk of time in the studio, but at the same time, if I'm like right in the middle of this amazing creative flow, and then some random thing happens, which usually is my daughter coming in and saying, I don't know, whatever, and then you sort of have to completely take yourself out of that flow because there's something way more important for you to deal with in that moment. And you can either choose to be frustrated by that or just go, oh, well, that's an interesting little side avenue into what I thought was my process for this thing that I'm doing right now. And then you come back to it and you're like, well, that thing doesn't work. I need to change that.
Yeah.
And that thing, you might have spent 3 hours not noticing that thing didn't work, And so I'm trying to stay on track and remember what the question was.
Well, it's just like chaos, basically.
Yeah, like embracing that.
Yeah, and the fact you can't control it. I thought you were going to say I have like a random module in my in your modular, but it sounds like you have the ultimate randomizer module walking around the house.
5-year-old.
Yeah,
totally. And I think it's really interesting. And I'm trying to. I guess it kind of comes down to like trying not to take anything too seriously, which is a paradoxical thing, right? Because the thing that you're creating, you want to take absolutely seriously, and you want to make everything as good as it can possibly be. But at the same time, within that process, I think it's really easy to get hooked up on the minutiae of the process of doing that, and thinking that all of these little parts of it are super, super important. And for me, as I get older and make more stuff, it feels like those minutiae are less and less important. And actually, you said something really interesting. I think it was on Wednesday, and you were talking about I've forgotten his name, but you were talking about A-Bing stuff, and it's like if you A-B stuff twice and you quickly and you can't hear the difference, then there's no difference. And that's basically it in a nutshell. I think it's like that is the kind of level of randomness and the ability to embrace the chaos. It's like, okay, well, yeah, if I sat here for 2 hours and worried about the 50 hertz in that kick drum, then, well, yeah, this one's definitely got like 0.2 dB more. But like, if I do this twice quickly and it still basically sounds like the track, then that's still basically the track. And I thought that was super. Who was it that said that? It
was actually a Chad Blake thing. I think it's something. Okay. Like he used the word flip flop, which I love as well. And for people who don't know or who are a bit younger and have only worked on computers, in the center of a mixing console or desk, depending on which part of the world you're from, you would have these buttons like I'm listening to what's happening on the desk, or I'm listening to an external input. So you could have like a full mix of something, or you could have 2 channels. So you go boop boop boop, and it's like if you don't notice it straight away, then it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It was
And I thought
such
that was,
a liberating
I thought that was
thought.
super important.
Yeah.
And and totally liberating and time saving.
Right?
Yeah, and it was like it's huge. And when I heard you say that, I was like, oh man, that single thing encapsulates so many of these things, almost like bigger concepts that I like fret about. And I'm like, oh yeah, if you flip flop twice, can't do the difference. There's no difference. Great.
But I was just saying, we were exchanging some texts and mails like through a certain chunk of last year, and you were just like agonizing over adding a performance mixer into your setup.
Yes.
And I think this is a good pivot, and we've had a few good questions in the chat. We'll come back and answer those. But your studio is like ridiculously dialed, and I actually talk about your studio all the time on stream, which is like I've never been in a session with, obviously like as a musician. I'll just bring this up on screen for him. And this is Matt's studio. So Matt is sitting over here right now. There's stuff all around the walls. Sorry, let me just bring Matt back here. But you have so many amazing ideas about how to just have everything happen instantly. And then once you started posting your YouTube videos of your performances with your mixer there, I was like, oh, okay, I really get how it's working now. So you're obviously like do a huge amount of thinking about how to get all of this gear together to support your work. And that's both like your vision as an artist, we might say, which we can say now that we live on the west coast of North America. We couldn't say that out loud in London without being lynched.
Goodness me, no.
Yeah, and obviously like hitting deadlines and the big film projects and stuff like that you're involved with. So I'm just kind of like wondering what it's like in your mind when you're weighing up one of these decisions. Do you lie awake at night just going, there's something that's not working here, or do you go on the webs and it's like there's a shiny new thing out and you're like, oh, I want the shiny thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do spend a vast amount of time thinking about solving problems. and part of that is because, so I guess like my if you look at like the jobs that I do that make up my career, it's like a certain percentage of Matt the artist, a certain percentage of me working on film projects, and a certain percentage of me doing musical director work for people's live shows. And the MD work for live shows is the part of it that requires definitely the most problem solving. And so, and I enjoy that. I enjoy the process of being presented with a bunch of problems, and it's like, come up with an elegant way to fix these problems. And like, I like that I get a kick out of that. And so doing live show MDing is kind of like, it's a good fit for that. And so I do spend a vast amount of time kind of thinking, okay, so we need to have these 25 instruments here that have never played together before, but somebody needs to be able to tweak some of that, and then you need to play that one backwards but up an octave, and it's all got to be in sync with video, and like, how do you make all that work? It's good fun. And so part of that, I guess, that like thought process and problem solving process also comes into my studio setup, which is on the verge of being too complicated for its own good now, I think. Well, only in terms of like, and I've been doing this for 20 years and I've collected some gear over that time. So I've got 20 years worth of stuff that I feel all is useful in my day-to-day work, but you've got to be able to get at it, right? As soon as you have to faff around for 30 seconds plugging something in, it's kind of like, well, it might as well not be there as far as I'm concerned. So it kind of got to a point where I just felt like I felt like my setup was too big. And if I suddenly wanted to record that thing, I'd have to go through this process of, dragging down an input window of like 64 inputs and go, oh, it's that one. Oh, no, it's not that one. It's that one. And it just became a hassle. So the solution to that for me was twofold. One was putting a bunch of stuff into the cupboard and getting rid of it, and the other part was going, oh, well, how did we used to do this back in the day? Oh, people had mixing desks, but mixing desks are generally big, and if like ones that are like high quality, whatever that means, are like stupid expensive. So I started looking into DJ mixers, and the one that ticked all the boxes for me is this Model 1 by Play Differently, which is basically a collaboration between Richie Hawtin and Alan and Heath. And I stumbled across it because I was watching this video. I was watching a YouTube video of Richie Hawtin talking about how he set up his last tour that he did a couple of years ago, and it was actually on the Apple campus, and he was doing this very in-depth talk about how he's got his gear set up and how it interacts with his visuals. And from an MD perspective, I found it really fascinating because I was like, oh man, that's like that's really like super high level, and he's really dialed with his stuff. And he kept on looking at this mixer that he had, and I was like, what's that mixer? That's super cool. And he didn't once mention that it was basically his own product, which I thought was kind of cool. But it's basically an Alan and Heath DJ mixer that has been pimped a little bit. And effectively, it's just a stereo mixer with some EQs and filters on it. And I've got one on one side of the studio, which has got a bunch of synths plugged into it. And I've got kind of my own like digital duplicate of it on the other side of the studio, which is this MIDI controller here that controls a Ableton template that is basically an Ableton facsimile of what the DJ mixer does. So I have like 6 synths plugged into it, but then it all comes out of a stereo pair of Ableton, which then goes into Logic, and Logic is my tape machine, basically.
Wow. So are you not doing the whole RME Q-Mix thing anymore?
I'm doing that as well.
Okay, we'll get to that.
I'm getting to that. So I basically got like all the stuff on this side of the room goes through one mixer, all the stuff on this side of the room goes through one mixer. And then they both end up in like my Logic tape machine in the middle. So if I want to record something, I start playing it and it's already going through the mixer, and then I've basically got 2 inputs in Logic, and that's it.
Amazing.
And it will either be from that mixer or this mixer. It's actually slightly more elaborate than that because I've got a couple of effects returns as well, but they're grouped tracks, whatever. And so I've gone from this place of having like a Logic template that's like 32 tracks deep to having a Logic template that's 2 groups of 3 tracks each deep.
Wow.
And it's just so much more fun and easier and great. So within that, sometimes if you really want to record 2 things separately and they're both going through the same stereo out, it's like, bummer. So they're still all on their individual outs. And the thing that you're referring to that I still use literally on a daily basis is I've got an RME audio card, which I absolutely love. I think RME are just killer. Super stable, sound really good, brilliant software. So the mixer software, which is like the equivalent of the Universal Audio console, is this fabulously like tiny font Germanic mixer thing that you look at it and you're just like, oh dude, what is going on there? But the fabulous thing about it is you can MIDI map the whole thing. And so probably 3 or 4 years ago now, I set up a bunch of macros in Keyboard Maestro, and Keyboard Maestro is an app that you can run on your computer all the time, and you can basically use it to make macros. So you can you can set it up so that Apple Shift F1 will go and do this long list of commands of things that you do on a regular basis. But in the case of the RME mixer, those commands can be MIDI CZs with values. So basically the RME mixer behaves like a patch bay. Little caveat about patch bays, because patch bays are brilliant and I used to own one, and then at some point I was just like, why do I have a patch bay? It's a total pain in the ass. And like the one time where your patch bay doesn't work properly or scratches, it's like this most cataclysmic event, and I'm like, I need to get rid of the patch bay. So the RME mixer is basically my patch bay because it lets you route any input to any output, but also mix any input to any output at any level, which is great if you've got a bunch of synths, because this synth might have a level up here, but this one's down here, but you want to be able to send them both to the same delay effect. And if you had a patch bay, you'd have to change the input on your effect to cater for the output of the synth. But because you're effectively going through a mixer, you just do this, so your input to the delay is always the same. So you can kind of gain match everything in a nice way. And using that Keyboard Maestro macro thing, it means that I've got I don't know, let me do this. So the top of my keyboard has got this little piece of paper. I don't know if you can see that along there.
Amazing.
Which has got all of my various inputs from DJ mixers and individual synths, and the routings for each. So, for example, if I want to send my Juno to the ISA channel strip and then to the Eventide space and the El Capistan, I press Apple Shift F6 and it happens. And then the outputs of those will be those 3 group tracks that I've got in Logic, which are always there. So you literally just go doof, record, and that is you're ready to go.
So that switches out like either of your mixer setups for a direct setup as well. So you kind of can switch between.
Yeah. Totally.
Are people understanding this? I'm waiting for the chat to explode of people with like the mind blown emojis. Oh, we have got one mind blown emoji in there. Thank you, MDA. This is pretty deep stuff.
I mean, it's one of these like slightly kind of ridiculous things because I'm super lucky that I've got 20 years worth of synths and stuff that I've collected over the years, and so you end up in this situation where you've got a lot of stuff to plug in. But actually, even when I've where I before last year, I used to travel around quite a bit, and I'd basically take 2 suitcases that had like a modular synth and my Army sound card and a drum machine and a couple of guitar pedals. And even within that tiny setup, having this routing ability, I found just saved me such a huge amount of time. Because then like the smaller the setup is, the more options for like interesting backwards routing you can have. So it's like, oh, do I want to go through the delay first, or do I want to go through the reverb first? And you can set up all of these different macros and just go doof, and then you're like, oh, actually that doesn't sound great. So you go doof, oh, that one sounds good. Wow. And that takes like a second, as opposed to, oh, I've got to unplug these 5 cables, gain match everything, plug in these 5 cables, find the input channels to record it onto, hit record, decide that I don't like it, do something, and I've found I guess it's been set up like this for 3 or 4 years, and I literally use it on a daily basis, and just can't really imagine not having that set up now. Mm-hmm. It's just, I totally love it. It lets you set up stuff super, super quick, try out things super, super quick, and move on to the next thing if it's not working. And one of the things that I find with particularly with film work actually, is that there's just never enough time, and so you don't really get the luxury of the entire day to experiment with this texture or that texture. It's just like, okay, I need to try 5 things, and one of them's going to be great and is going to be the thing that works. But in order to get through those things quickly, you need to have your studio dialed in such a way that you're not spending like half an hour of those 40 minutes plugging stuff in and moving stuff around. So I love the RME stuff for that point of view, because you can MIDI map the whole thing, and it's a total game changer for me.
What was it that led you to having the breakthrough to use that? Like, was it just like a mate was doing it? I know you've been messing around with Keyboard Maestro for a long time, but like I've never heard about anyone having this kind of a setup. And I remember sitting down in the back of your room exhausted after Louise Burns put her bag on the sofa for weeks straight. Thank you, Louise. And just you were explaining that to me, I was just like, oh my God. And at Little Tangent Matt, we were having a chat on stream a few weeks back, because Travis Ference on his podcast had an opening thing about limiting beliefs. And it's like, your system there shatters one of my limiting beliefs, which is like avoid AD-DA conversion like the plague. And I remember when you're like, oh yeah, it's like going into the computer, then it's going back out to the fuzz pedal, then back in. Like, I was like sitting there going, well, it sounds great, but in my mind I was like, but you can't do that,
I mean, I'd love to have an entire stream just on this topic. But yeah, it's a real thing. And in fact, a neighbor of mine here, among many amazing things that he does, he builds really high-end hi-fi speakers. And when I say hi-fi, I mean like, beard scratching people listening to 192 kilohertz wave files, hi-fi speakers.
Turning the cables backwards and forwards.
Exactly. And they're incredible. They're like astonishing sounding. And I had this big conversation with him at some point, because I think I was saying to him, I was kind of going, yeah, these are amazing, but those hi-fi dudes that buy like $500 mains cables, that's just nuts, right? And he was like, well, is it, Matt? and he gave me his whole philosophy, right? Which I'd sort of thought of but hadn't thought of, and it's kind of like this. It's this idea that, is your 500 mains cable demonstrably better than my $2 one? It's an impossible question to answer, because if you believe that it is and it makes you enjoy the music better, then it's definitely better. It's like nobody can argue with that fact. And I kind of feel it's the similar thing with the ADDA. I took a position a long time ago that I just didn't care.
And look how happy you are now.
But that's absolutely not to say that if somebody else has decided that the ADDA in their signal chain is a key component of their process, then that's absolutely a key part of their process. It's like all of these things are belief, right? Me talking about my RME mixer setup, like for me, that's a total game changer. But maybe that it may be the case that for somebody else, if they do actually want to spend 20 minutes going around the back of their rack unpatching stuff, then that's part of the process. And then when they come back to it after that point, they've got this other viewpoint of the situation that I don't have, because I've just gone doof. One is definitely not better than the other. It's just finding a process that like ticks all the boxes in your brain. For me, the ADDA has never been a thing that has ticked boxes in my brain. So I kind of gave up thinking about it a long time ago. That being said, we're also super lucky that we're in 2021 and it's kind of difficult to buy a bad DA.
Yeah,
right?
it's not like...
It's a different thing than it was in 1996.
Totally.
Where, there were definitely crappy sounding converters. But now even the crappy sounding converters are pretty blooming good.
Yeah, totally. And it's worth saying as well, like I was mulling it over, it's like, well, Matt is sending that out to a distortion pedal. So the point is to change how it sounds,
Well, this is the other thing.
Yeah.
Like I record predominantly synths, and I absolutely refuse to believe. Well, no, that's a bit strong. I don't know. But it's a synth, right? It's like, what part of that synth's character are you trying to preserve by sending it through a $20,000 A to D? I much more easily buy the idea that if you're recording an orchestra, there might be these intangible humanistic qualities that are captured by really good converters at high sample rates. I'm absolutely, I can totally get into that as a concept.
Yeah.
I personally haven't experienced it yet, but like on paper, that makes a lot more sense to me than recording my, MS-20 that's got a noise floor of like minus 30 dB anyway. And it's like, well, what am I trying to prove? But all of these things, I think, really come back to process. And for me, my process is about having these defined setups that I can get through a bunch of processes super quickly with. And in order to do that, I need to have a bunch of macros set up, and I need to send stuff in and out of the computer all the time. And for me, ticking those boxes for the process far outweighs the possible sonic benefits that I may or may not get. I do a whole bunch of things, from like writing out string charts to creating samples to actually mixing a record. So, if your actual job is mixing records, then your whole priority set for your production and what ticks all those boxes is going to be completely different from mine. So yeah, I think it's finding out what works for you and what doesn't. And no, I'm always kind of skeptical of people that are like, oh, this is how you need to do this. just like I tried to tell Björk when I was 25
totally.
that this is how you need to do a live show, and she's like, not really, Matt.
Is it?
So
Is it?
It all goes back to that.
Yeah. Hey, this is perfect kind of like segue, because Paul Artila, who's in the chat, just mentioned something about Paul, what was it? You said something about brass players being cranky or something like that. And I think this is a really, really interesting point. Just talking as well about the way that Björk sets stuff up, and where are we? He says brass players are a surly lot, said Paul. And I remember that was one of the things that was such a challenge for you, is you had been used to writing charts for basically A-list London players who would come and record at Abbey Road, and one of your biggest challenges was you had written one of those, and Björk put together a brass section of people who had never done a tour before. So you spent quite a lot of time trying to figure out how to get the best out of those players. And would it be safe to say that once the tour was underway, obviously every single one of those players was a legend as a human being, so it's the vibe was wonderful, but once the tour actually kicked off, the vibe of them as a crew and on stage and as players really took on its own life. And I think that's when we really understood, again, the genius of not just hiring the best brass players in the world, but getting this particular energy into the situation.
Totally, yeah.
So I'm just wondering if you could share with us a little bit the psychological process you went through of trying to get that working in that context, and then also, I guess you've already confessed about going past your own limits of how things were supposed to work.
Yeah, I know. It's a really fascinating thing. I remember years ago I read a biography of Benjamin Britten, and one of the things that he did a lot was write music for specific performers. So even though even in his own time he was A-list composer, but he was still kind of going, well, I'm going to write this piece for this singer or this piece for this cellist. And I'd never really even thought about that before, because I was I've done quite a lot of work for film scores and you're super spoiled in a way. It's you can pretty much write what you like, and the A-list players in London or LA will make it sound incredible, because they'll just look at it and go, oh, what, you mean this? Oh yeah, okay, yeah, I can do that. And it's ludicrous, the level of professionalism and ability in those film players is astonishing. And like you say, I when I was doing those charts for Björk, I was kind of writing stuff in that way, where it's kind of well, musically, this is the best thing. And it's yeah, but that really doesn't matter too much. And it wasn't, and it wasn't that they couldn't play that. It was the fact that if you want to get the best out of individual performers, you need to play to their strengths. I guess it's kind of if you're recording a vocalist and you're kind of well, I think it's going to make more sense if the middle eight kind of goes a bit more like this, and they're yeah, but that's not how I sing. And yeah, but it's going to be really good but that's not how I sing. It's how far do you push it? You've got to let people perform how they want to perform. And so with those brass charts, it took me quite a while, but eventually I was oh, well, these people sound really good when they play this kind of thing, and these people sound good here. And even though this is horn 3 and this is horn 1, if we swap the parts like that, that person's gonna be able to play this like this. And
so it wasn't even just horn 1 will play in this register and that one, so you're kind of in a way intermingling the lines, which would have been for one player here, and you had to get them weaving together in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make it sound like I sort of took apart every single note of the score and went, well, how was it? It was more of a general feeling of stuff, and the way things were written and phrased, to play to hopefully play to people's strengths. And even really basic stuff, if you're playing a tuba for a 2-hour festival set is pretty hard work. So like, give them a break once in a while.
Yeah.
You know, and those things really make a difference. Whereas if you're writing a film score, you don't really take those things into account that much, because it's like, oh well, they're going to play for 20 minutes, then they're going to have a break, and they're getting paid a ton of money, and they can just deal with it. You know, and so you don't, or at least I don't take those things into consideration so much, because the ultimate end point is, we just need to record all this stuff that's been written and signed off by the director and the producer and make it sound like that, but better, and, you know, deliver the project, you know? And I guess like the other side of that coin is going, oh, well, how can we actually make this a pleasurable experience for everyone, you know? And I think there is a place for both of those things, you know. Sometimes you do just have to get the job done, and it does have to sound like this. And yeah, it's going to suck for a while, but you know, you're in a recording session, you're not touring it for 2 years. And I think that was really the hugest difference. Like for me, and that was the first like touring experience that I'd had. And so the parameters involved in that were things that I hadn't really experienced before. And it became apparent really quick that it is a totally different set of parameters. And I was definitely coming to that gig from the point of view of, oh, I've done a bunch of this stuff before, I kind of know what I'm doing. And in a sense I did, but only for this little version of that. And this was a completely different version of that had a totally different set of parameters. And I think that I think those things really sort of trickle down into everything that I do now. Is I try to be a bit more. It's what we were saying earlier about like the you know, the rules of music and how they apply or don't apply. And I feel like I'm also kind of like pleasantly astonished when I meet people, you know, work with people that are like in their 20s and have already got all this dialed, and they're like, well, yeah, of course you wouldn't do that, because you're just gonna do. I'm like, wow, it took me 20 years to learn that, you know. So I don't feel like I'm you know, revealing any great industry secrets here. It's just something that has taken me longer to learn than I perhaps should have taken to learn.
Okay, fair enough. And how was the transition then from working on, like, you know, setting up Volta to setting up Biophilia, but then playing the Biophilia tour? And incidentally, Jussi, who's a buddy of ours over in Helsinki, was saying the Helsinki tour show of Biophilia is one of the greatest shows he's ever seen. I don't know, were you on that one, or was Matt on that one?
Annoyingly, I actually wasn't on that one. Yeah, it was a bit bizarre. I set up that tour with you, and then I did about the first 6 months of it, doing all the shows, and then somebody else did like the middle 6 months, and then I did the last 6 months. So there was a period in the middle, which actually was when all the European festivals were happening, which I wasn't playing on.
But old Max just got to walk straight into your setup, bless him.
Totally. Yeah.
So, but how was, I mean, I know that you'd like done a ton of gigs and played live a lot, but going on stage like in Björk's band in front of crowds like that, did that give you another insight into how this all comes together, or did it change your outlook on music as a whole or anything?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to ask you the same thing as well.
Oh my God. Should we go there? Should we compare notes?
Yeah.
Well, I asked you first, so you got to go first, and then I'll...
Okay. I think I one of my biggest regrets about my whole involvement with that particular tour is that it took me literally about 3 months to get over the sheer terror of walking on stage and doing that.
Right.
That there's a good 3 months where I just couldn't answer that question. Because I found it really challenging, because I felt like my job was to MD the show, and in order to MD the show, I felt like I was basically responsible for making sure that all these various things happened, which was, you know, although there were other people like operating these systems, fundamentally I had to make sure that it all interacted with the music, which is, really mundane stuff like making files with time code on it so that the lighting guys can program the lights, or making sure that I make an MP3 with the correct arrangement so that the person operating the teleprompter that can have the right lyrics up. All of these little things that I sort of never even really thought that you'd have to consider become quite big time-consuming jobs. Running rehearsals, doing the sound checks, making sure that a very bizarre and elaborate series of mechanical instruments actually work, all that kind of stuff. And then you spent 6 hours of your show day basically on this crazy adrenaline, oh my god, is this ever going to work kind of thing. And then it's like 3 minutes till showtime. You're like, oh yeah, now we've got to do a show. And I really struggled with the balance of being able to flip into that secondary thing, because also within doing the show, I'm still like subconsciously trying to take note of, oh, that thing didn't go off in time, or this bit we need to work on, and making this mental list of stuff that I needed to do the next day. And so it really became like maybe I got that completely wrong, and that actually that point should have just been, you know what, just do the show.
Well, to be fair to you, Matt, for people who don't know, the Biophilia tour had like kind of 20-foot tall robotic harps, you had Tesla coil bassline machines going off, you had a 26-person choir, you had a Reactable, you had all of your setup. That was all synced to visuals. You're playing in the round, I guess, on some of those shows as well. Like, there is a lot going on. So we're not talking about guitar, bass, drums, and keyboards.
No. It was a fabulous. It's still definitely by a long margin the most complicated show that I've ever been involved in.
And it's worth saying as well, like the kind of musical director role in Björk's crew is like you are the interface between all of these different departments. Totally. That also has to serve her creative vision.
Totally. Yeah. And so and part of it was also because we'd probably been working on that for a good, 6 to 9 months before the first show happened in various capacities. So for 6 to 9 months, you're totally in this headspace of the executor of creative vision. It's like you don't have to come up with any ideas, but you've got to make damn well sure that you execute the other person's ideas really well. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of stressful, but it's great as well. I love it. But then to suddenly flip from that point on show day one to going, oh, now it's all rock and roll and it's all about the performance, I found really difficult, and basically failed to do that for several months. So then anyway, but then I reckon certainly by the time we got past that and things were starting to be a little bit more, wheels are set in motion, things are starting to get a bit more dialed, then I definitely got to experience more the sort of do the rock and roll show thing and actually sort of observe it a bit more, which was so fascinating. And so I it still blows my mind what a massive privilege it is and was to be involved in something like that, because for my own project, I go and do some gigs, and I've done some reasonably large gigs, and it's all great fun, and that's awesome. But it's just a totally different experience when the show that really sticks out for me is when we did Fuji Rock at the end of Biophilia, and there was intro music for the show, and then Björk would walk on stage, and there'd be 15 minutes of people screaming before we started the first song. It was insane. And you're just sort of standing there on stage going, okay, so that's what 100,000 people sound like when they scream at you. It's completely insane. And such a massive privilege to be involved in something like that. And then do the show and then see how she manages to take that show through all these peaks and troughs of rock and roll, and then kill it at the end. and still leave people wanting to do the whole thing again, you know? So how does that shape what I do? I mean, it's kind of it's difficult. I mean, in a sense, like, it's just I think it's like I said earlier, it's more, the thing I take away from it more is just the complete inspiration of working with someone who's got the attitude and self-belief to be able to do that. And then you start to try and understand what it is about those people that enables them to do that. And then those are the things that I find really fascinating. So, you know, I think I found it really interesting how she would put a set list together for a show and structure things energetically. And then also, you know, see that play out over 20 shows and be like, oh, did that work how you expected it to? How was that little thing we did there? I mean, it's like an endless sort of trough of psychological inquiry, you know. But it's also definitely meant that when I do a live show, I make it so that I have to think about the very, very bare minimum, least amount of stuff, because having done a bunch of biophilia shows where I was basically like was sort of paralyzed by technical accomplishment in a way. It's just like, oh my god, all these things need to work, and in a sense, I'd much rather have not been performing on stage and dealing with all that stuff, because then once you're actually performing on stage, you just don't want to deal with any of that. And so when I set up my own live shows, I try and do it in such a way where I basically kind of don't have to remember anything. And if something goes a bit pear-shaped, it's not going to have a knock-on effect that's going to make something else go a bit pear-shaped. Which is exactly what I used to do, you know, when I was 17 years old and would play in pub bands. You know, you just turn up and play, and it was fun.
Yeah.
And yeah, trying to keep that element of fun in it is super important, I think. Did
you hit a point where
but
you're just
you
like,
need to answer now?
Well, we need to fully unpack what you're saying. What was the turning point where you went from stressed out making to-do lists on stage to being able to enjoy playing? Do you think it was just like the fact that you had done however many shows meant that you'd kind of stress tested the systems and you could trust it? Or was it that you yourself had to go through an internal change?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't really know. I think it was just this kind of culmination of going, it's going to be okay. And realizing, like we were saying before, realizing that even the things that you think are not okay are somehow actually okay.
That's really important. Yeah. That's huge.
And then going, oh, well, hang on. If I'm stressing myself out about things that literally no one else cares about at the expense of being able to perform this show, then I'm not doing my job, and B, I'm just missing a really great opportunity to have fun.
Yeah.
So it's this, I think it was just over a period of time, it was this culmination of going, you know what, it's okay. And also hugely important, being surrounded by other people on the tour who had decades more experience than me, who were also all going, it's gonna be okay.
Right.
And you know, like the techs and the front of house people and people working on monitors, the lighting people, the people building the stage, the pyrotechnics people, like, I think I was more stressed than all of them
combined, probably.
But they'd all had way more experience than I had. So at some point you're kind of like, well, one of us has got this the wrong way around.
Yeah.
Which isn't, and it's like I said earlier about like taking things seriously. That there's taking things seriously in that you need to deliver. But if you're taking things so seriously that you're actually then failing to deliver on some of the things that you should be able to deliver on, which in my case was actually like performing the show, then you're not doing it right.
What do you think about that whole thing where it's almost like perfectionism is actually like a self-defense mechanism, and it's actually like you think it means, oh, I'm trying to do this perfectly, but it's actually kind of in some way avoiding letting an idea come out, or it's like avoiding, I don't know, stuff getting out into the public, or it's an avoidance mechanism.
It's so true. Yeah. It's so true.
Yeah.
And I found this. I really want to come back to your answer to this question, but I'm just going to do a little caveat here.
Let's
first.
do it.
So, I started my YouTube channel in January, and this was a totally new venture for me, and so many fascinating things have come from it. But I want to talk about two.
Okay.
One is exactly what you were saying, which is that idea of hiding behind perfection. And the brilliant thing about the YouTube channel for me is that...
Incidentally, I'm dropping the link to the YouTube channel in the chat right now, if anyone's not on there.
So basically, making videos takes a huge amount of time, and I put quite a lot of thought into trying to make it not take a huge amount of time. And so I'll decide on an afternoon when I don't have a ton of other projects on that, oh, I'm going to do a video this afternoon, and it has to happen that afternoon. And from plugging the first light in to hitting upload, that's an afternoon. And if it takes more than that, I can't sort of justify the time to do it. So within that, you make all these micro decisions where it's like, okay, well, was that okay? And is that, I don't know, is that lighting okay? Or is that actually in focus? Or all these things that you do. But my particular boundary is, well, I need to upload it in 4 hours. So that thing I can't worry about. This thing I probably will. And it's been a really great exercise in not hiding behind perfection. The other thing that I found really fascinating about it is that because I've taken some of these things from songs that I did, at least a year ago, and I'm sort of distilling them into things that I can actually perform in real time, suddenly I'm able to look at things in a way that probably a producer would look at a project when they come into it, like that the artist has been working on for 3 years.
Yeah.
And then a producer comes in and it's like, yeah, well, you know what, I think that's how you want to start this song. That's your intro hook or whatever it is. And you have this perspective that you're not able to have when you've been really in deep with the project. So I'll take a multi-track for a song. And I'm like, okay, so what am I going to put on the drum machine? Okay, well, that's the important bit. And what am I going to play here? And what's actually the melody, And distilling it into those ideas. And also arrangement-wise, it's like, okay, I love a elongated, evolving arrangement. But if you're trying to put it into a hopefully slightly more engaging 3-minute YouTube video, it's like, well, there's nothing in that intro that is interesting right now. So it's like chop, 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 and there you go. You've got it. And I found that process really, really fascinating. And I'm sure that in doing that will kind of influence the next record that I do, which isn't to say that it's all going to be 3-minute pop songs, but it's just that awareness of mental attitude when you're given a slightly different set of parameters in which to make something work, But yeah, I definitely find that, it's just so easy as humans to hide behind excuses for things when they basically come from some form of deep-seated fear. Yeah. Which isn't to say that the fear isn't legitimate and real, but part of, I think part of our process and everything is overcoming that in some way. And just in the little micro world of me putting out records, quite a lot of it is hopefully the ability to let go of how many people are ever going to listen to this, and out of those people that listen to it, who are going to like it, and out of the people that like it, how many are going to bother actually buying a record, and out of the people that buy a record, how many actually might write a review on it. And it's so easy to get totally paralyzed by all these concentric circles of doubt, and then eventually for me at least, I'm always totally inspired by working with people that seem to be completely unaffected by all of those things, and they're just like, yeah, I'm doing this. I'm going to put it out.
Did you used to have like a, well, it's fine for Björk because she's Björk, or it's fine for Liam the Prodigy because he's Liam the Prodigy, or it's fine for one of the, big name composers you work with because they're them? Like, what did you have to do to actually flip that switch in yourself? Especially, there's so many people on here that we've talked to are like in the process of building up a series of releases, like self-release stuff, or they might have put a couple of tracks out. So we talk a lot about how to build a catalog, how to build a body of work, how to make sure you're focusing on what matters. By the way, Matt, like I stream 3 times a week, so I want to do my answer to the question like when there's 2 hours of me talking, like we got 20 minutes of chatting with you, so I don't want to burn through.
I'll remind you on Monday.
But yeah, I mean, I think like just the fact that you have found a way to consistently make and release music in the middle of everything else that you've got going on. I don't know if people understand like quite the intensity of like when you're on a film project. And guys, like we can tell you, Matt has been involved with a number of like triple A-list heavy-duty blockbuster films. I'll let you choose whether or not you want to name any of them, Matt, because I know you're a bit secret sometimes. You've got, obviously a young family, and you're still managing to make and release your own music through the midst of it. But yeah, I really love what you're saying about like those spirals of doubt that could stop you from even starting something.
Yeah, totally.
And how you flip those switches in yourself.
I think it's for me personally, it's really, I keep saying this, but I do feel so sort of privileged to work with some of these people that I not only really admire, but I'm also sort of fans of their music and have a little insight into their version of that mental process. And so I don't think I've ever really kind of had that thing where I'm like, oh well, Liam Howlett can do that because he's Liam Howlett. But then like you don't have to be in a room with Liam for too long to realize that like he's not doing stuff because he's Liam Howlett. He's not going, oh well, I can get away with this because I'm Liam Howlett, which is like the only sort of justified response to like us going, oh well, he can do that because he's Liam. He's not thinking that, he's just doing it. He's not, or at least my sort of view of it is he's not kind of going, oh well, is this going to be as good as the last record, or what are people going to think if I put that ride cymbal in mono, or it's just like he just like does it. And it's this like it's on one hand it's self-belief, which I think is a really difficult thing to inspire in people, but on the other hand, and I think this is much easier to inspire in people, it's like it's having an idea and being confident in the idea or the concept, which is a different thing from being confident in yourself. And it obviously helps if you're confident in yourself, but like for me, as someone who is a bit of a like reclusive introvert, I wouldn't describe myself as a super self-confident person, but for me, I find it like it's kind of a interesting deflective strategy to go, yeah, but this idea that I've got is solid and sound, and so I'm going to work on the idea, and then it kind of doesn't matter what people think of me because I'm just working on this concept, and all the things that I'm doing are working towards this concept, and I'm going to put out this record, and the record is about this concept. It's not really about me, it's about an idea that I had. And for me, that's a sort of useful little separation tactic.
That's amazing. I think that's incredibly useful. And that goes back a little bit to like what we were talking about right at the start of the conversation, which is that you had the concept for this record, and then that became a project brief, which I think you're able to approach almost as clearly as if it's a film brief or a commercial brief, or when you're working with an artist or setting up a show. It's like, this is the thing that has to happen. But then I think you've spent just like your ability to deliver on a brief can take over from any internal monologuing you might be doing, for example.
Yeah, and I think again that's sort of a deflective strategy, right? It's like, well, I've come up with this brief, better deliver the brief. And then it makes it so much easier to like make the bad producer shut up for a minute.
And actually, Matt, just to unpack a little bit like what you're saying about like when you see these people, I kind of was talking about in a way like people who are established. When you see someone who's successful and they have a budget or whatever, and they can hire people and go to the studio. It's easy to say, well, that's easy for them because they've got this. But they didn't get the budget and the studio and the success and then become that person, did they? It's
totally.
you know, and it's fascinating, some of the conversations I had, you know, specifically like we can say with Björk or with Liam about like early days. Like, you know, and Björk's talking about like when she was 15 or 16 and doing a back of the van tour of Europe and they had like no money for food or showers. Like, and you're like, oh yeah, you're still 100% the person that we're seeing like headline Fuji Rock. Yeah, and it's like
which is brilliant because she'll pull that out occasionally if somebody on the crew starts bitching about the quality of the tour bus.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
And it's so I mean, it's just brilliant because you can't argue with her. You know, it's like there's no oh my bunk's not big enough. It's like, well, I spent 5 years in a transit van going around Europe. What are you complaining? You know, it's amazing. And I always I think that's so true also, like of you know, getting tied up on gear and I say this fully in the knowledge that I'm surrounded by quite a lot of gear, but you know, I've collected it over 2 decades. But you know, it's so easy to go, oh well, if I just had this synth or this drum machine or this mic preamp, suddenly all my vocals are going to be amazing. And it really does. I think it's really healthy. And for me, and I do this myself as well. It's like, you know, look up how some of the greatest records that you love were made. You know, a few years ago, I got really obsessed with Sigur Rós guitar sounds. And at that time, like he had the Gibson SG and some pretty wild effects and some very cool amps and all this stuff. But then I looked at what he was actually using on like the first 3 records, which are the records that I really, really love. And it's like this, you know, secondhand Ibanez SG. Was it an Ibanez? I can't remember. But it's like a, you know, relatively cheap copy SG with like this old Digitech reverb thing that it's like, you know, it's stuff that you could buy in a secondhand store for like $300. But he did it. So it's like the genius is obviously not in the gear. And I know you mentioned this briefly the other day about the Beatles recording with one compressor. And you know, like the stuff we've got to make music now is just so mind-blowingly heavenly compared to what people have always had, and people have always made great records. You know, and that's not going to stop me wanting to buy a like what, you know, name fancy synthesizer here. It's like interesting new things definitely create inspiration. They're fun to have, but it's also one of these like negative things that it's easy to like crush your creativity with, where it's like, oh well, Liam Howlett can do that because he's Liam Howlett, or they can do that because they've got a studio, or this person can make wicked beats because he's got, I don't know, whatever you need to make wicked beats. But they're all just the negative things that stop you from doing stuff.
What do you think the biggest luxury is of having like a well-stocked studio? The
biggest luxury, I mean, I think that I mean for me the luxury is the speed to do stuff. So like, for example, the Juno has basically been on the same sound for about 3 years. The modular synth on this side of the room has had the same patch on it for about 5 years, and the one on that side of the room also hasn't really changed for it. So you end up with specific bits of gear that do one or two things, and you basically never move them. And the luxury of that is that it makes it super, super fast to do stuff, because oh, I need a sound like this, oh, it's going to be that,
right? Or
I need a sound like this, oh, it's that thing, rather than trying to make something from scratch every time.
Yeah, I love that's a really good insight. I remember actually reading about, like, you know, big name mixers when they were still using outboard, and it's like they had like 2 of every kind of compressor, and just seeing stuff where they're like, oh yeah, I never touched the settings on that. And that was just like, what do you mean? Like, don't you have to do that on everything? And so that's really cool. Any other like,
the luxury is the speed, I think.
Right, cool.
But I think you talked about this before, and I think it's a very similar analogy, like in the in the software world of, taking a few days to actually organize your samples and loops and beats into folders that you can access them irrespective of what DAW you're using. It's like that's the sort of analogy of it. You've got to put in time to get to a point where you've got the luxury of speed of choice, and that time can be acquiring gear over many years, or it can be spending X number of days literally going through sample by sample and going, oh, that's a bit like this, so that needs to go in this folder. And like that organization side of things and putting in the legwork to buy you the time when you actually need to create something is just, it's huge.
Yeah,
it's like programming this RME thing. Took like 3 days. It was 3 days that I didn't do anything else. But I've used it.
Probably the best 3 days you've ever invested in your life.
4 or 5 years.
Yeah. And Matt, that just another one of the many ways in which Matt is so deep. We met when you were known colloquially as Maintenance Matt, because you spent a year on a placement at Maintenance and Strongroom. I had no idea you were on a placement from like a Tonmeister course and that you had all these other aspects. So again, this is like where Matt is like the endless onion. So for the first year that I knew you, I thought you just knew how to take an SSL apart. And that was, your focus of all your abilities. I didn't know you had covered like all this other areas as well.
I mean, I could take a channel strip out of an SSL.
Let's. It sounds cooler saying take it apart, but I think it's
don't let the truth get in the way of a good story.
But this is Well, the point about this story kind of ties into what you're saying, which is like, if you look on paper at like the spec sheet of a studio, you might go, well, this one has these preamps and that one has those microphones. But what makes a studio great is the thought process behind the people running it, ensuring that it can all work effectively. And it's impossible to communicate. It's like the biggest intangible, I think, of record production, like the thought that you put behind how is this actually gonna go down in real time.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, the individual bits of gear don't make stuff for you. Speaking of individual bits of gear, our mutual friend Louise has a question in the chat. She's just saying, Matt, what are your thoughts on soft synths?
I love them, but my basic thoughts are, I reckon about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, I feel like we got to a point where there's no reasonable way that you could say that a soft synth and a hardware synth sound better or worse than each other. Probably more than 4 or 5 years ago. It's been quite a while now, I feel, where the way that people code soft synths and the computer power to run them has meant that you can get incredible sounds out of them, and I use them quite a lot. For me personally, I have a real stumbling block of sound design creativity with using a mouse to patch stuff and design sounds with, and that's almost certainly just because I kind of learnt my chops on hardware synths. So like it's always been that way for me, and I can do stuff on a hardware synth way faster than I can on an equivalent software synth, and I just enjoy the tactile nature of like turning something this tiny little bit and going, oh, actually that makes this huge difference in sound, or patching something here. I enjoy that process in sound design, although like I just said, my particular patch on here hasn't changed for about 5 years, but I do turn the knobs occasionally. So like for me personally, I enjoy the sound, I enjoy the like sound creation part of doing it on hardware synths, but I don't think that the software synths like per se sound any worse. And there are definitely elements of software synths that, depending on what kind of thing you're doing, sound better. Like, I mean, I still like, if I want a, kind of rip your face off down the middle synth sound, I'll probably use Serum rather than, one of my modular synths, just because I know I can get that like thing quicker and probably better in Serum than I can with the particular modules that I've got. And there are hardware synths that do that thing. And Hydrasynth in a way is kind of like that. But but yeah, they're just different things. I would love there to be a some kind of like haptic feedback iPad controller for software synths, where like the screen kind of had little bobbles in it or something, so that you could actually feel where stuff was and edit stuff. Excuse me. And even if there was like a touchscreen controller that somehow could immediately just map. Well, and yeah, I guess you can kind of do this by just dragging your software GUI onto a touchscreen. But you know what I mean? It's like it's that fluidity of having some kind of touch control over a soft synth. I think would be a total game changer for me.
Yeah.
But yeah, in general, I think they're really cool.
Yeah.
The one I use Serum all the time still, even though it's a bit like old school now.
Old school.
Well, you know what I mean. It's like it's not the new kid on the block anymore. Yeah,
it's established.
I love the things like I still think Absinthe has got amazing sounds in it. There's this one called Alto, Aalto. And I forget who makes it now, but it's kind of like a Buchla inspired soft synth.
Right.
And I don't have any hardware that even approximates that kind of thing. So it's like a totally different territory.
Yeah.
The only other thing I will say about that is that, again, for me personally, I really like dealing with audio. So I really like recording a synth and having it as an audio file and be able to move that audio file around. And for the way my brain works, there's a level of like committing to sound there that I really like. And if I do use soft synths, I'll quite often just commit the MIDI to audio anyway, because that seems to help me like move through the production a bit more rather than
it's interesting, isn't it? That whole whatever that psychological thing is, when you see the MIDI notes on the screen, you're like, it's not real yet. And then you turn it into sound. It's like, it's my multi-track, you know?
Yeah, totally.
Matt, there's actually something there's something else that you said that really stuck with me when Louise and I were in your studio. And I think we were talking about one of your synths or whatever, and I was like, oh, why don't you just get like rack modules or desktop modules? And I love what you're saying, that's like even the feel of the keyboard helps you think about each of your synths as like its own instrument. And this goes back to a fun story, just part of the peeling the onion thing. I remember Neil McClellan, I went into whichever studio he was working in, and he played me like this crazy kind of like acid synth bass line. And I was like, what the hell is that? And he was like, oh, Matt did that. And I was like, oh, so did he like sequence it? And he was like, no, he just played that on his left hand and then was like going like that with his right hand. And it was like some really like crazy bass line. And I think that was the first time I'd actually seen like, oh, there's like techno and synths that you're meant to go like that with, because I'd always seen people going like that. And it's like, oh, you can go like that. And I know some people think that's kind of dumb, but the way that you are able to kind of like really, I think, turn your high-tech stuff into a performance instrument that you develop a relationship with as that instrument is very special. I think instrument design is one of these other things that just really fascinates me. I think is that what industrial design is? Is that like the design of like stuff? Product design, yeah.
Yeah, but I really liked it when you and Louise came over to do those sessions here. It was just really awesome. I had such a great time doing it. And it was really fun to be able to play stuff and get like a really immediate feedback from Louise and you and kind of going, yeah, that thing's really working. That thing's not so much. Oh, maybe just try doing this. And all those changes can happen super, super quick. Because it's just like, oh, play it like this and turn the filter down on this bit, and it's all those things can happen really, really fast. But I think they can only happen fast if you've got like an instrument interface that allows you to do that. And I really, I bought the Dave Smith Prophet 6 when it came out in the keyboard version, and then I moved to Spain for a bit and had to suitcase it all up. So I sold it and bought the module version. And I kind of liked the keyboard version. The module version I literally just never really used. And it's kind of stupid. It's like, it sounds exactly the same. But because I couldn't play it, it felt different. And I've had the same thing with the Electron Analog 4 that I use a lot. I've got the I've got the analog keys, which is like the keyboard version of the Analog 4 module. And at some stages, I've owned both, and the one with the keys for me is just like a totally different instrument. And I think there's a bunch of stuff. There's a bunch of different stuff going on there. I think with the Prophet 6 in particular, I think instrument designers really do lose sleep over where do you place the envelope control and where is the filter and what kind of instrument is this meant to be, and like, are you going to be playing with your left hand and tweaking with the right hand, or are you going to be playing with the right hand and tweaking with the left hand? And so it's not by chance that there's just this, the knobs are over here and some are over there. It's like the designers put them there because they feel like they're going to be useful in that place, and the whole thing creates an instrument. And I feel like with a lot of the modules, they're usually afterthoughts, and not quite the same level of thought has gone into that design process. And so particularly if I'm like sitting here with my MIDI controller, but the module's over here, and I'm trying to, it just doesn't work. And the feel, the feel of different keyboards, I think, is so important. Like the MS-20 has got the crappiest keyboard on it in the history of keyboards, and yet it makes you play particular things on it because those are the things that you can play. Gadonk. So you'll do certain things, and it's not velocity sensitive because it's a CV keyboard, and that's a whole other thing. Because small tangent. So like velocity sensitive keyboards work because you press the key down and the key goes down to here, and it measures the time that it takes for the key to go from here to here. And that amount of time is like a linear relationship to how hard you've hit the key, right? But the problem is that then you press the key down and you get a note on here, but your note off doesn't happen until it goes back up here.